Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Haroon once again. Welcome back to our second installment where we are looking at Sufis, saints, and swords. So I want to continue from what I was discussing in the previous video and talk about how Sufis were at the forefront of resistance against state oppression and struggles against colonial powers as well. It's very much invisible today, but there's a rich history of Sufi resistance behind many of the contemporary struggles against state repression. I talked about the Uyghurs, and I talked about Khoja Wali Khan of Kokand, who led a rebellion against the Chinese as well. But two decades before his rebellion, there was another fierce Sufi leader who led the resistance against the imperial Russia at the time, Imam Shamil, very famous. And he's known for his charisma and his unrelenting commitment to upholding the Sharia in what was now becoming for him at the time a hostile environment for him and the Muslims. But what he was really good at was uniting groups like the Dagestani and Chechen Muslims in resistance to Russian imperial aspirations. Right, and so he's remembered. He's very much venerated, in fact, across the diaspora, especially people from that part of the world as well. And he also inspired a quiet resistance to underground illegal Sufi groups in the USSR. Then in 1825, we're told that Imam Shamil met another an important leader, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was inspired by him, and the two exchanged strategies for resisting these foreign threats. 5 years later, we know that France invaded Algeria. At the age of 24, Abdul Qadir would find himself at the center of resistance against colonial colonization, the French colonization. And so he was part of the Qadiriyya Sufi order, and they can trace their lineage back to Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, who's a descendant of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And he was able to, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was able to unite all of Algeria to rise up and take arms against the French. Now, of course, this Sufi resistance was not led by men alone. You have Sufi women like Lala Fatima, who led several battles against the French. Fatima was captured by the French eventually, and she died in captivity, and her story is worth reading as well, and maybe I'll share a video which you can read or watch rather on her as well. And so the French were often frustrated by the Sufi scholars who led resistance against them as well. Even if you look in West Africa, in what's modern day Senegal, you'll find Sheikh Umar Tal, who led a 55-year recluse. He was living in a zawiya, in a khanka for 55 years because he was part of this Tijaniya Sufi order. But he was then forced into a life of military resistance against the French. And they actually say that legend has it that he had spiritual power such because of his wilaya, his friendship with God, that he could destroy enemies, combatants, people who would come to fight him just by staring at them alone. And you have like the famous Tijaniya litany, which is called the Hizbul Sayf, the litany of the sword. And people might think this is a book about fighting, but rather it's a manual, a military manual on the ethics of being a good person, akhlaq, virtue, and how it's important to have good character traits and the importance of knowing God as well. So this is very, very important as well. It's worth remembering that if you look at the European side, the colonizers, they didn't have any ethics, right? You think about at the turn of the 20th century, another North African resistance, which happened in Libya against Italian colonization. This was part of Sheikh Umar Mukhtar, who's very famous as the Lion of the Desert. He was part of the Sanusi order, and he organized and led a resistance against Italian colonization for nearly 20 years. And in contrast to the brutality of the Italians, Umar Mukhtar made sure that he followed the Sharia, whereas they would kill Muslims. He said, no, we follow the Sharia. And when he was asked that, why don't we do to them what they did to us? He replied, as a matter of factly that they are not our teachers. In other words, we don't learn our virtue, we don't learn our ways of justice and good and evil from them. We learn it from the Prophet, peace be upon him. He was obviously captured later on, and they never treated him the way he treated them, and he was publicly hanged in 1931. So they were scholars, they were Sufis, they were committed to seeking knowledge, dhikr, which is the remembrance of God, and they were committed to building communities, and they preferred that over combat. But when war was imposed upon them, they opted for what we would call a lesser jihad, right? And that came at, for many of them, a risk to their own lives as well. You can take the example of the Syrian Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who left his Zawiya in Syria in an attempt to defend Libya from Italian incursion. And then he came back to lead armed resistance in Palestine as well, where he settled and established regular mawlids. But he was also at the same time the forefront of defending Muslims as well. And so these are very, very important legends for us to be aware of. Even early on in Islam, you'll find Ibrahim ibn Adham, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, who become, for example, role models for depicting Sufis and Mujahids. And there are books that are written on this topic. For example, you'll find Neale's book, very, very interesting, Sufi Warrior Saints, Stories of Sufi Jihad from Muslim Hagiography. So worth reading that book if you get a chance as well. So they were at the forefront, as I mentioned, defending Muslims. You'll find this in South Asia. Fazliha Khairabadi issued a fatwa of jihad against the British, and Titu Mir, who was a seasoned gymnast and wrestler, trained his fellow countrymen in Bangladesh to fight the British using lathis, bamboo sticks. And you find many, many examples in Islamic history. Sometimes you find that combat was unseen. And a really good example, a modern example, is the Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, and there's a book that's been written on him, worth reading if you get a chance. Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad from the Cambridge Muslim College has done a lecture on this, and I'll hopefully share a link to it for you to watch. He terrified the French colonial forces in Senegal without ever shedding a single drop of blood. He founded one of the largest Sufi orders in Senegal, which is called the Muridiya order. And he led a non-violent resistance to colonialism, despite him spending himself most of his life in exile and the house arrest. And he wrote books, The Seven Tons, which is of scholarship on poetry. So this is something that we need to be aware of, and we don't fall into this trap of thinking of Sufism as something that's odd or bizarre, or it's not part of Islam. It's fundamentally part of Islam. And the scholars that were involved in Tasawwuf and Sufism were not only saints, but if they had to become, as duty called, they would also become warriors as well. So it's worth reading their lives. I hope that's been useful, inshallah. Please do share your comments, feedback, and I look forward to hearing from you all very, very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.